Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Geotech Hour. I'm Bob Woodruff from ABC News. It's such an honor to be here to talk about the topic of data security and global food system. I also want to introduce my fantastic, actually, she's my cousin, not only just working as the top of the agricultural world, but she's one I grew up for the last, I hate to say it, about 60 years now, where we've been very, very close friends. But I just want to say thanks to everybody who's joining this topic, which to me is a crucial one on the current Earth that we have. So I'm going to hand this over to Molly, who can give some introductions and let us know what exactly we're going to talk about tonight. It's extremely fascinating. Molly?
Oh, you're muted, Molly.
We don't hear you.
Hello, everybody, and it's always a joy to work with Bob. Actually, I have to say, before I start my actual remarks, I did my first scientific experiment on Bob. We were little kids, and I wanted to know if hiccups were contagious. So I got really near him in the back seat of a car back in the day when you just threw all the kids in the back seat of the car, and I hiccuped, and guess what? He got the hiccups. And for years, I thought hiccups were contagious. Fortunately, my science has improved since then. I'm Molly John. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin, faculty affiliate at the University of Illinois Center for Digital Ag, and a very proud and happy non-resident fellow at the Geotech Center at the Atlantic Council. And in that regard, I am extremely delighted that the Geotech Center has understood these topics, which have been at the center of my scientific career for about the last 10 years, to highlight the importance of technology, advances in technology, advances in the collection, curation, governance, and deployment of data assets in the food and agriculture space, and to elevate these to issues of both U.S. national and global security, both in a defense intelligence mode and also as key elements in economic security. So we have a very distinguished slate of panelists that will work with Bob to make this hour very lively, and we will, I hope, focus on the issues related to the generation of data and the integration of technology in this space. So with that, I would like to introduce Dr. David Bray, Director of the Atlantic Council Geotech Center, and a longtime friend and ally, huge help in elevating these issues through the last 10 years. David?
Well, thank you both, Bob and Molly, and I have to say thank you, Bob, for hosting this very special Geotech Hour. We could get used to this, so we welcome you back anytime. And Molly, thank you for everything you're doing in the food and agriculture space. I know we met about 10 years ago. It was right before the holidays and a snowy day in DC in a classified facility, and it's interesting to see where we've gone since then. But maybe I'll go first to Molly and then to Aaron, and then Bob, turn it back over to you for additional questions. I mean, Molly, you've talked about why this is so important, but you have spent years trying to encourage people to recognize that food impacts global food, impacts security, impacts our stability as both nations and as a world. It impacts safety. It impacts thinking about how agriculture can feed us all. Could you tell us real quick, if you had to make the case to the next administration, because we have had a change in administration in the United States, or to make the case to the Secretary General, why is it so important that we start thinking about the stability and security, especially for open societies, when it comes to food and agriculture?
Well, it should go without saying that that humanity's need for daily sustenance, water and food, and really it's impossible to separate the conversations about water from conversations about agriculture and food and climate. It should go without saying that these are issues of the utmost strategic importance for the future of humanity, for the future of any nation states, communities, and for our commitments to each other, because distribution of clean water and food, inequities in those patterns drive, track and drive a number of adverse dynamics such as conflict. So really what I would say to a new administration is that it is way past time to correct the doctrinal deficiencies. They are actually doctrinal deficiencies that mean that our country fails to see clearly non-military threats to national and economic security. We don't see food and agriculture in that light. We see them as we understand the economics, but COVID actually brought into very sharp focus a real snap that no amount of money will buy you food if there's no food, and so a number of characteristics of the food system: stability, resilience, safety, equitable distribution, health through healthy diets. These now are far better understood to be connected to each other and connected to the future of this nation and all nations. And I'll just close by saying, at the end of World War II, there was this historic sort of fork in the road. Coming out of World War II, the War Department, and some people might think that's ironic, but it makes perfect sense, and the US Department of Agriculture were part of a global movement to extend the commitment that the Allies had made to each other to ensure that no person in an allied nation would starve, to extend that commitment to every single human being on the planet. The idea was that that would occur through the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, and the War Department and the USDA committed to that policy. However, FDR had just passed away, the Truman administration came in, the Truman State Department did not support that policy. They were interested in using American agriculture and food manufacturing, food export, to establish and strengthen American trade hegemony. And so they actually undercut that announced policy. And we have the system that has run since that time, since the mid-40s. And so as a consequence, our nation doesn't understand food and agriculture the same way, for example, China does. China within our lifetimes has seen abject famine and understands and is obviously acting globally, consistent in many instances with our own laws. They're also acting very much in the United States food system. For obvious reasons. A population that doesn't have enough to eat gets crabby really fast. You can look back and see riots over a slight increase in cottage cheese prices. And so I think we are perhaps at that crossroads again. I hope we are. And with new stakeholders, US Department of Defense, and big companies, finance, insurance is really concerned about the nature of this instability and its impacts, not just in food and ag, but across all sectors.
It's hard, Molly, if I can just butt in for a second, because you and I have had all these conversations. None of my friends, or really mostly those that I work with, have no idea what you're talking about in terms of how this problem that's swept around the world is really not being felt really inside in our backyard. So you have to go to these countries overseas. I've witnessed some of this in parts of Africa and the Middle East and certainly Asia, like northwestern China, where there are crises of could be ultimately starvation, as there is in other parts of the world. when do you think Americans will start to realize this is the case? I mean, as you said, COVID is waking us up for the first time that we have a gigantic backyard that is ours as well. But when do you think it would be that the U.S. American citizens will start to understand that this could be the major security problems that we're going to have in our country?
That's a really great question. And I will look forward to hearing from both David and Aaron as well on exactly this point. But I think that the time might be now. For the first time, policymakers in Washington, D.C. went to the grocery store for the first time in their lives, saw bare shelves and wondered, how can that be? Well, it wasn't that we didn't have food, but our distribution systems have not been optimized for stability. They've been optimized for efficiency and low cost. And so there's a lot of rigidity and brittleness in those systems. We were not able to reform broken links in the supply chain at all quickly. And for the first time in, I don't know, in how long, Americans saw empty shelves in grocery stores. I think that there is a movement, and it actually centers in the United States in the Department of Homeland Security, because this is a critical infrastructure, that these issues may have an opening thanks to COVID. What we hope is that the third pandemic, the first actually was not COVID, but a major swine disease, I'll bet you very few people who are listening to us have heard of, that killed half the pigs in China last year. The second pandemic is COVID, and we always live in fear of influenza. So we're starting to see these compound events, and I believe it will take another jolt, perhaps. I think we may get another jolt. We expect, people like me in my business, we know we will get another jolt. We just don't know exactly why or when. But I'm hopeful that with a new administration coming in, and with the very sobering year we've had, hottest year on record, more acres burned, more storms hitting the United States, at some point, there's a threshold here we're already over. And I hope that the impetus to take action may be now.
And as David said before, anybody else, please start and have the conversation without having me ask.
Aaron, why don't you jump in? Aaron.
Well, I'm just so excited to be here, David. Bob, nice to meet you. I feel like I'm at a family reunion. And Molly, of course, whenever she calls me in, and particularly we got to reconnect during COVID when, it was some tough times. I would say one thing is that we have had a health crisis. We are very lucky we did not have a food crisis. The food system bent, it didn't break. I think all Americans, as we go into Thanksgiving this season, really should have the ability to honor their harvest and really reflect on what it took over the last 8 months to get food to their plates. And it was a feat. And I think people are waking up, and we saw digital selfies going up on food plates, and then just automatically start connecting back to the grocery store workers and the farmers for the first time. And that does give me hope. But I'll just explain quickly who we are and why I'm so excited about this topic. So U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action, we fundamentally believe that action is required, unprecedented action in the next decade to address climate change and food security. We believe that this sector is the one sector that can solve for climate change and have a handprint in our society. Last year, we brought about 200 leaders into a hot barn and said, why aren't we taking action? What can we do to really live our values and put our strengths to work to deliver on the planet and our community? And I will just say this, it is not business as usual for our farmers and ranchers. In 2019, I had the privilege of seeing Mississippi farmland, about 400,000 acres underwater. We saw winter move into spring at an unrelentless rate, where our farmers couldn't get into the field and couldn't get out of the fields. And then, of course, every farmer this year was planting for hope. And then we got COVID, and then we got the derecho, and now we have fires. So this is not business as usual for our sector. We see our farm increasingly having economic, we're beyond measurement, economic strifes. And then at the same other end of the food supply chain, and Molly will know this, in the United States, we already had 1 out of 6 Americans who were food insecure, only exacerbated as we saw the effects of COVID. So I think what I hope we can discuss on this call today is that these issues are happening block by block. They're really happening on our farm gates. We're starting to see the extreme and episodic shocks to the system, and how we start planning for adaptation and resiliency of this sector matters. And I'll leave one last comment that I hope we can talk about. The sense of urgency in investing in these systems now is critical, because our agricultural sector, unlike other sectors, can, I always say brown and green things are the cool things, can actually suck down and store carbon and enable a transitional net zero economy for 2030, 2040, and 50. So we have seen some impacts this year, but what we do now matters.
And I really liked what you were saying, Erin, that what we do now matters, and that this is not business as usual. Not only is it the impact of COVID-19 on the food system, but like you said, the derecho and now fires, things do not look good for 2021. And so we have a responsibility to start thinking now what we can do better. And like you said, it's both about building resiliency at the local level for the farms themselves, but also having better early warning of maybe things are getting too dry, and therefore that's a sign that there might be a risk of fires. I know, for example, Australia is actually pioneering, or they're using satellite photos and imagery to actually have better ways of combating the fire, which is kind of ironic because, as I mentioned how Molly and I met back in the mid-90s, I was actually involved with some efforts that were using what was formerly Ballistic Missile Defense Organization technologies in the mid-90s to actually look at picking forest fires up from space. It could not be classified at the time, but we actually successfully did it. We showed that you could actually scan the wind conditions, the topography, pick up the forest fire from space, and try and estimate where it might go. And that used to be requiring billion-dollar satellites that were classified, but now we've got commercial technologies that can do this, and increasingly will be available. And so I think it's both, how can we approach the business and the livelihood of being a farm and doing agriculture at the local level, like you said, through better approaches to carbon storage, more resiliency, but also thinking about how we as a whole, possibly focusing on data, can have better early warning of shocks to the systems like derechos, like forest fires and things like that, that's available to everybody. And maybe we first figure it out here in the United States and then scale it to the world, getting back to Molly's vision of, I mean, we do produce enough food on this planet to feed everybody. It's not a production problem, it is a distribution problem. Now, we do need to get that food to be produced sustainably, so we need to achieve that. But if we set the goal and have the bold and audacious goal of the United States will work to a world in which everyone is fed sustainably, just think about the diplomatic impacts of that and how that could create a lot of goodwill and alleviate future strife, because now people aren't rioting because they're hungry.
So Bob visits on a regular basis places around the world where societies are breaking down, and the implications of those breakdowns for, of course, for humanitarian conditions in that place, but for ripple effects all around the world, I think are now far better understood than they were even 15 years ago. The Arab Spring being probably a huge wake-up call for America, as well as the rest of the world, for what can happen when an agricultural system fails. We will be dealing with the consequences of that drought in Syria probably for our lifetimes. And I know Bob has seen firsthand those dire circumstances where food is used as a means of control of populations, and where interruptions in food supply cause great suffering and exacerbate either cause conflict or exacerbate it. And I think it's really important to realize in these conversations that occur in the United States that conflict and interruptions in food supply go hand in glove. And whether it's civil or military, it's extremely important to understand those linkages and act early and often to forestall at least food in agriculture, or the failure of agriculture contributing to mass migration, famine, advance of violent extremism, and other really, really awful consequences for the people involved and the rest of us.
I think when the places where I have been is you're seeing that the failure of agriculture has almost been at least first because of weather. People are not used to a one season being radically different than the last one. This happened for history, but not as fast and as so severely as it is now. And when you see a lack of food, because that year they had not been able to plan for it, and certainly they don't have PhD degrees in these kinds of the world to make sure they can figure out what to do next year. Then you see people fleeing to find food somewhere else. At the same time, you're seeing the biggest difference between the rich and the poor that starts to develop. So when we go, as the journalists go to these places, we don't starve. We're able to get the food. But then you see the people pouring out of their villages and run somewhere else. And then that leads to the uprisings, or they'll fight back the government. So all of these things of security are absolutely entered we've always had refugees when people run to get the food somewhere else. But now in some ways they can't get over the border because of security fears by countries. They don't want to allow any more refugees to go over the border. So now they're going to a place that's just as equally starving.
Bob has had a chance to be firsthand witness to the Rohingya crisis, and I think failures in agriculture and distribution of food, the use of food as a political means of influence, has been really important in that story, right, Bob?
Obviously the Myanmar government was, yes, first burning down villages, really, to force people out of the country because they wanted, I don't know how many people know about the Rohingya, you probably do, but the government of Myanmar does not want them in the country anymore, so they have different ways to do it. They can tear down their villages and set them on fire, or deny them food. So those people are leaving the country, and they know they're being treated a lot better when they go into Bangladesh right next door. But it doesn't seem to me that that's agriculture right now. It's not that they don't have the ability to grow their food. That is purely a government wants to force them out. But then Bangladesh is the country that needs help in terms of food supply. Because that's the other thing, when I say food supply, it's partly they can't grow it in these crises, but they also have no way to figure out how to get the food to them.
And I think exactly what you're talking about, the food distribution, knowing how to get it to people. I mean, we saw, for example, when the hurricane happened in Puerto Rico, unfortunately, that, not only was there a challenge of getting food on ships to the island, but once you got the ships there were cases where the trees were down and the roads were closed. And so that's where we do need to think about data and technologies. I mean, should we develop technologies that can actually deliver some of these things by drone? Because maybe we can't get there because the roads are impassable, or maybe it's just simply that it's hostile. And if we try to send actual people in there, it might be dangerous. But if a drone can deliver food, that actually helps goodwill. Or maybe it's balloons or something like that, some other ways of getting it there. And I think that puts another dimension on this when we think about how food and agriculture relates to security. I know we talked a little bit about this is, in some respects, getting ready for the impacts that will happen with climate change, unfortunately, that if we don't get it right now, then think of this as a dress rehearsal for the more challenging things that happen in climate change. And I think COVID-19 has demonstrated we got a lot of things wrong, so maybe we can learn from it. But the other thing to think about it is the dimension that technologies that were only available to nation states 30 or 40 years ago are now available to individuals and consumers and companies. I mean, I mentioned, for example, the space example, that you can near real-time imagery of anywhere on the planet in 15 minutes or less notice at 25 centimeter resolution. I mean, I pause whenever I say that because I feel like that's something that I shouldn't disclose. But wait, it's a commercial technology, so it's out there, it's open. And when that becomes available, that raises very interesting questions of how do we not become surveillance state? Because clearly some countries can use that technology. They may be able to solve their internal food problems, but they'll do it in a way that is surveillance state. We in the United States have to figure out how can we use these technologies and not make it a have versus have not who don't have the technologies. We need to empower small farms as well as large farms, and at the same time make it participatory and not make it surveillance state. And so in some respects, it's both about solving the immediate, which is how do we feed the planet and get food to people better, but also learning how we can use these now super empowering technologies. I mean, think about it. We just saw yesterday, for example, Amazon announced that it's getting into the delivery of prescription medications through Amazon delivery. Well, imagine if there's a future pandemic and that's the way we actually deliver things. And again, it's saying that we need to figure out how things that used to be done solely by government maybe now can be done by the private sector in partnership with government, but at the same time not become surveillance.
Can I raise my hand?
Of course. You're the moderator.
I go back to class again, so I always like to ask questions like that. Because the next one I saw when you know, now we're looking at the pandemic and we're looking about the government support. You know, I'm doing tons of stories now about the vaccines that are being developed, which is the unbelievable kind of government money that is poured into vaccine companies so that they could start to develop before they've even proven that their vaccine is efficient and safe. How has the government been, or how do you think the government will be in terms of stepping up its funding to you guys, to, you know, developing and studying a way to avoid the kind of next agricultural pandemic that could hit?
Well, maybe I can just mention that actually this same group was together yesterday at a workshop that NASA funded. NASA is a really interesting funder for this because it's a generalist agency, right? Their job is to generate imagery of the whole world and support the commercial sectors. And the focus of that conversation was very much inside baseball about, you know, who gets to hold this obligation to the American people. How will that actually be added to our government's portfolio capabilities? Because this is not government controlled space. It's privately owned. And to David's point, there are a lot of sensitivities in this space, commercial sensitivities. American farmers are not crazy about Big Brother or black helicopters looking over the fence, right? And yet we have learned that collectively we're exposed to these properties of our supply chain. So we have a question from the audience that asks, how can data and technology help us to rethink supply chains to be both efficient and resilient? And I think that's a really interesting question. We came together at the beginning during the pandemic, right? March, April, May, things were really looking bad. And instead of, as David said, looking to the government always to help us, a number of us mobilized from our different sectors. Erin represents really a whole umbrella group of private sector entities that care about this. I come from academia with public sector obligations, and we work together to try to piece together a federated approach to do a better job redirecting stranded food supply to food assistance. Right? Sounds really easy. It has been really hard. But the good news is major companies have come in to help. Google has become a core partner in a supply chain initiative. Another company that's been very helpful is Repositrack. Craig Newmark of Craigslist has taken an interest in this through contributions to Bob's the foundation that Bob put together after his injury. Bob and his family put together after the injury to help with food assistance. I'm really excited when I see the likes of Craig Newmark from Craigslist having a good look at this space, because we need nimbleness and we need a sort of quick ability to reform broken links, to detect and reform them. And that is a technology challenge, but it's not a new technology challenge. It's actually a very familiar one. It's consistent with this much larger set of trends where we share more, right? Airbnb, or sharing cars, or sharing all. We have discovered that there is tremendous opportunity in making more dense our existing systems. And so I'm really hopeful, but it is proven to be very hard. And I'm not surprised, but I think we've made some good progress, and I hope I'm wrong, but I think COVID may not be done with our food supply chains. And I'm hopeful that the work we've put in, a lot of us, since March and April, may pay off, as we may very well see closures again of major facilities important in our food supply. One set of results, I'll just say this really quickly, that came out only as a result of people who live in Washington, D.C., going to the grocery store and not being able to find pork. There's a very capable organization that does analyses for defense. They were really worried. They wondered what happened. They did an analysis of some public data the University of Illinois had put online, and discovered that actually a huge amount of the US food system flows through 2 counties in California right next to each other. Massive vulnerability, right? And yet it's thought to be a resilient system, a lot of links, but there are these embedded, consolidated hubs that are we're at the heart of what we experienced during COVID. So I'm really hoping that the likes of Craig Newmark and Google and others, bringing their views from having solved similar problems in other sectors to actually this nimbleness or agility in food supply chains, and the recognition that we've got to take food assistance into account, may make a big difference the next time we get under pressure.
Well, I'm going to ask one more thing, because Molly, I think along that same line, you're talking about 2 different types of those from the private world, private unit companies, et cetera. One is for like charity work, for people to help others, and other ones for profit. I remember the one thing that always surprised me, and this is years ago, where you said that the first time we really had the US military, and I guess it would be NASA, et cetera, to want to share all of this information with other private companies, like insurance companies, food companies, investment companies around, because there's something about sharing this information with each other. And I remember was a Coca-Cola, a chocolate company or something, you said was able to give all of its
Mars.
Right. So tell me about that. So I think there was a time when the government and the private equities would not ever really share information, but now they do. And what happened with that? Because they finally realized there's going to be worldwide starvation and security issues, is why that suddenly happened, and how?
So I think this is a really beautiful question, because it highlights the need for pretty intimate partnerships in the 21st century to solve these challenges that don't know borders, and they don't know sectors. They don't respect our old-fashioned way of binding things up and taking care of them. So an example of that is a great example where the government was able to set the standards for an explosion in the private sector that's relevant for ag. Is actually is all the breakthroughs in genetics. When those started, which were at the beginning of my career, the National Institutes of Health said, if you're going to take our federal money and do research with it, you're going to have to put your results in a public database. That's a requirement. Or you take our money, that's what you have to do. Well, that money went into a public database, or that all that information went in, and the private sector was able to use that. And we've just seen an incredible explosion in the last 20, 30 years as a result of that first move. So transparency in food systems has been something that a number of us were very concerned about, and rightfully so. But actually, there's been quite a breakthrough. Just last year, a young civil engineer at University of Illinois published the first view of the American food system at the county level. She published a paper about county level food flows. And she put the data that she and her group had put together and the model output on the web so others could have a look. Well, what happened when COVID came along and those important people in Washington, D.C. saw bare shelves, they were able to hunt down her work and do additional analyses, which have revealed to them some characteristics of the U.S. food system that really, and have documented for the first time, how this consolidation in our food systems could blow up in our faces, and actually did blow up in our face here and there. Aaron is right. Through extraordinary heroism embedded all throughout across the whole system, we did not see catastrophic failures. But one of the problems that came up was essential workers, food workers, were getting pulled over by law enforcement during the lockdowns. It wasn't understood that people driving to the meat plant were essential workers with clearance to do that. And so simple things like that, like making sure that local law enforcement understands that that food workers are ag and food is an essential service, and they should be allowed to move freely even during dire conditions. So I think that there are lots of ways the government can set standards to enable sharing, especially if we get out ahead of it. But standard setting can be done in community as well. It's just, it often helps if there's a little bit of a carrot and a stick. And I know David has a lot more to say about this, and I think Aaron does too. Aaron's group has specifically provided a lot of leadership on exactly this issue related to sharing of data and its use for both public and private purposes.
So maybe Aaron, you want to go first, and then I'll do a rejoinder.
Sure. So yeah, couldn't agree more that we're not investing enough in our food and ag systems. And that stems from foundations to science, all the way to actual private investment. And we are launching a decade of ag, really to commit towards that vision and common action platform for the food and ag sector. And one of the key action networks that we think is required is to unleash data science in the hands of our farmers to rapidly deploy, so those farmers can be climate action heroes really on their farm, which they're already doing. But we know more about Mars than we know about our soils. And we also know that the private sector has a lot of information. IBM owns weather.com, Airbus owns satellite monitoring, but none of this is integrated. So as Molly mentioned, this idea of the Human Genome Project, we partnered with Foundation for Food and Ag, which is like the NIH of the U.S. food and ag sector. And we are really creating a call to action that we need to have data interoperability. We need the private sector to donate data so we can get smarter faster, because we really need to move this data set really in about 2 to 3 years so we can start getting deployable solutions.
So if I could build on what both Aaron and Molly said, so I definitely agree it's about the data. I think, though, we've got to recognize that the way data used to be done before it became so important to the livelihoods of the private sector, we may need to think about new ways. I've got the battle scars from sitting on government committees with the private sector trying to set standards, and those things are extremely slow. And I often like to say, standards are like toothbrushes. Everybody wants one. They just don't want to use somebody else's. And so what I think we have this opportunity to do is to think about, whether you call it data trust or data co-ops, ways where the private sector can provide data for a public benefit without revealing it publicly, if that makes any sense. Because a lot of cases, I mean, I know there are cases where certain government agencies have turned to the private sector and say, we need your data and we want to buy it all. And they're like, but then we're going to make it available to everybody. And you're like, well, you realize if you give all our data to everybody, then our company doesn't exist anymore. And this is, I think, a interesting coordination challenge, because again, countries like China just don't have the same challenge. They tell their private sector what to do. If you don't like it, you're fired, imprisoned, or worse. That's not what the United States can do. And so we've got to figure out how to overcome what I think are coordination and perverse incentives to not share. And again, it's not saying we share everything with everybody, but can we create, and the same thing is true for small farms. Small farms may not want to reveal specifically what they're farming because that may give up some competitive advantage or something like that. So we need to figure out, just like how we need to protect privacy for the individual, we may need to protect intellectual property or in some respects, data rights. And that's something that quite frankly, the US is absent from a conversation at the moment. We watch what's happening in Europe with general data protection regulation. We watch what's happening in China, which is all your data belongs to them. We've been laissez-faire, but this is a case where laissez-faire hurts us because it's an absence of a strategy. And I think that's why, particularly with agriculture and food, it's so important we get this right, because not only is it a dress rehearsal for how we'll deal with other pandemics, whether they be natural or, heaven forbid, human caused, but I came from the world of bioterrorism, and let's face it, COVID-19 has probably made a lot of radical insurgent groups say, you can do all of this with a simple virus. So we need to be ready for that future, but also thinking about how we can not become surveillance state, but be more nuanced in how we bring, whether it's through data trust or data co-ops, we bring private sector with local communities and scale to national, if not global level. So to me, that is why I think it is so important that, you hope in the next 100 days of the next administration, they realize this is a way I can get a triple win, both on the agriculture side, also on the resiliency side, and on the private sector and data side as well.
That's when I think essentially, unless I missed some, you're talking about sharing information within the United States between private companies and the government, what the laws may be, what the agreements may be. But what about sharing this kind of data, whether surveillance from space, looking down at the Earth, or certainly something that Aaron talked about with agriculture in the world of tariffs. And we know that China is buying a lot of food from us and us from them, and we're sharing things more than we ever did before. What is the law and what's the idea for sharing this kind of data information and surveillance information with countries that are either allies or enemies?
So,
go ahead, Molly.
I just happen to have right next to me notes from the August meetings of the Homeland Security Advisory Committee that says, so first and foremost, when we look at our supply chain, we really don't have visibility across our supply chain. These are public minutes. One of the initiatives we're looking at, and we've had briefings from, again, the intelligence community as well as DHS elements, is looking at how we can maximize some of the collection here. This is not a new idea, but the idea is they will be suggesting that a supply chain intelligence capability for federal government is a good idea. DHS is ideally suited to be able to address this. And in fact, I think that's a great, it's a great acknowledgement, although it's also disturbing in a sense that we don't already have this. I think that's been the most upsetting thing for me in the last 10 years is I kept thinking, it can't be that we don't do this. It's just, I can't seem to find who's on first, who's taking care of it. Well, I'm really excited to see, at least in these minutes, acknowledgement of the need to do that. We're starting to really understand and surface our dependence on other countries for certain really essential things, not just in food and ag, but certainly in food and ag. And I think we're starting to recruit entities that have not historically invested to invest in these areas with the idea that not only sharing the information, but learning how to sieve through it quickly and generate decision relevant insights, as well as what are the decisions that can mitigate negative effects, who makes them, in response to what cues, I'm really hopeful that a formal focus on that is starting to develop, and a recognition of the need. Sorry, David.
So I would, no, go ahead. I would just say, Molly, I would say, while I'm glad to see that acknowledgement, I am, with all respect to DHS, absolutely wrong idea. That is a path to bad things. All respects to DHS, and I can't believe they're even recommending this in 2020. I mean, that is appropriate for the 1950s, but the thought that
Come
somehow
on, at least the 1980s or 90s.
No. By the 1980s, we were learning that the future is networks, and that solution of we will have all the data and keep it in one place, and we will know everything, and nobody else will know it. That's Cold War. I mean, that's old Cold War.
If I left that impression, I'm sorry. That's not what they're favoring. It's more like a finger on the pulse for particular signs. It's not owning it.
Right. No, but here's what I would say. Here's what it needs to
Sorry.
be led by the local communities. It's got to empower the edge, because the reality is what we've found in data efforts, when you try to do something centrally, you remove context, you remove relevance. For example, in public health, if I see plague in the American Southwest, I'm not immediately thinking that's a bioterrorism event, because those in the local level know that plague is endemic to the American Southwest. But if I see suddenly plague in, say, Connecticut, I'm like, did someone travel to the American Southwest, or is that bioterrorism? Because at the local level, you know it. And so when you remove data from the edge, you remove its context and relevance. And so if I was trying to recommend whether it's the DHS or someone else, in fact, I wouldn't put it underneath DHS, because I think DHS should be a feed from something led by someone else, whether the Department of Agriculture or someone else. But the DHS lens will make even our allies a little suspicious as to, well, what are you doing here? And do we need to do this to our own supply chains? And we're already seeing, for example, Europe say, well, we need to know our supply chains where they go to Bangladesh or other places like this. And we also will, if something goes wrong in Bangladesh, if you're a European country, we will hold you responsible, not just in Bangladesh, but also in Europe. And so I worry that this will become a blunt instrument of trade wars, including with our allies. What I think we need to do is go back to the context of it's about the community. The community should own its data. And what you should do is find ways to enter in incentives. So it's indirect action. You don't tell ants where to go. You put sugar in certain places, chemicals in other places. How can we make it so that communities and the private sector want to do this organically, but it's not orchestrated by a government agency? And I know that's hard. It's new ways of governing, but I think it's got to be not top down. It's got to be empowering the edge.
Well, this is the best TV when you guys have really, debates like this. So Aaron, Aaron, start screaming, will you? Tell them how they're all wrong.
No, I love, these two are definitely the data skill set engineers here. But I mean, for me, from a farmer's perspective, we want to make sure that farmers get to share outcome-based information. A lot of times people are trying to get inside and understand what they're doing. And I just take always ask people to substitute the word farmer for the word chef. You would not go into a restaurant and ask any chef to give you all the secret recipes of how they're cooking.
Exactly.
Sauce, but yet for some reason we think that we can ask a farmer all of these questions. And what we really want is the outcome, right? The wonderful meal. And I think we need to focus on that, because then the data will be shared a little bit more. But what our farmers do, it does provide a lot of ecosystem service outcomes on behalf of society. We just need to make certain we're showing those results, and that those results get factored into climate data modeling. Those results get factored into climate resiliency modeling. But if we keep asking our farmers to give all the secret sauce of what they're doing, they won't. And so I do get, David, your ant and sugar analogy, because largely everyone's asking for all the data when we really just need outcome-based data and to make better decisions.
And what I want to say is, in Mali, this is how we met. And I love these discussions with you, because we met, actually, it was a debate. It was a snowy day, and it was about information sharing in a different context. In this case, it was counterterrorism. And I was talking about how, you go back to Federalist Papers number 51, they said, what is government but the greatest reflection of humanity? If all men and women were angels, no government would be necessary. I think we need to embody that. We need to show the world a way that recognizes, in an era in which more and more of this is the good news is it's being democratized. Farmers can do it, companies can do it. It's no longer the privilege of just governments to have these assets. But to your question, Bob, what does it mean if a not so friendly country now has 25 centimeter resolution imagery than everyone on the planet? We've got to figure that out, and we need to figure it out fast. And this gets to Molly's why, again, I think this is a wonderful triple win. If we can figure this out for food, we can figure it out for other things. Let's solve it for food because it does feed the planet, but it also addresses a world in which the idea that you could hide everything in a bunker and nobody else would know about it is increasingly disappearing.
Is there anything, okay, sorry, go ahead, Molly.
I was just going to say to circle in a direction that's going to seem left field, but it really isn't. When I first got really worried about this, I could see that I was going to get capital and nowhere with government, and did get nowhere with government, ours and a number of others. So I did a pivot because I thought that I could see significant risk that was unaddressed. I did a pivot and I turned to the financial community. And specifically, I ended up working with insurance. It turns out insurance, of course, it's all about controlled transfer of risk. They make money when bad things happen. And so unlike everyone else, they actually had an incentive to talk to me because they make money when bad things happen, provided they can insure, provided they know enough about the bad thing to insure safely in it. And long story short, we published a major report in 2015 with Lloyd's of London, where we simply socialized the term food system shock, which didn't exist before then. And then last year, 2019, we did another major report called Evolving Risk in the Global Food System, again under the Lloyd's brand. And it was when I brought those Lloyd's reports back to the United States that I could get government's attention. And so informed capital, I think, is risk-informed capital is a very powerful way. It is the way that is consistent with our nation's political and economic system. And I have been really impressed with the sophistication. This is the business they're in. They've done this with risk after risk after risk. If Lloyd's can figure out how to insure the space shuttle or Liberace's hands, Lloyd's can figure out or help us figure out how to value risk and the benefits of risk avoided. And so one of the sort of third lane, government being one, and the private sector and decision-making being another, the third lane I see is finance in general, but especially insurance. So that's a shout out to all the actuaries of the world. And I won't say a single mean actuary joke because there are lots of them. They're my heroes.
Well, and actually just a real quick close on that. I mean, I think that's a wonderful example of finding someone whose incentives align with yours, and so it's less of a push and more of a pull. And if you think of what is money, what is capital, I define it as it's unspent futures. Can you motivate people to put their unspent futures on a world that is a more resilient global food system, both at the local level and at the global level? And like you said, it's motivating not just government, motivating not just the private sector, motivating not just what I would say actuaries. And let's think about it, is there a role for CPAs to be CPAs for data, for example? Is that something we need to think about? But motivating the local communities and the farmers themselves to put their unspent futures towards a better way as opposed to the way we're currently doing it. Erin?
Everybody wants.
Well, the only thing I would say on the unspent futures is that there's just fundamentally a lack of investment in our farms right now. So, we're seeing the third most challenging harvest season in a generation. Our farmers are on economic collapse. So I fundamentally believe we have got to make certain that we are investing in our farms for our future. The unspent future you're talking about is right. Our kids, right? The ability to nourish that next generation through our farmers. So we need to make certain that both the insurance and the investment sector is seeing agriculture as the sector to invest in. Right now, we're not. And I think that we've forgotten that even though we have a small percent of GDP, okay, we're not a high margin sector like healthcare or Silicon Valley. But we're a sector that matters. We employ 15% of the American workforce. You start thinking about transitional economy and growth, that's this sector. We underpin the rest of it. So fundamental to get the data is to make certain that the investment models are really looking at agriculture as the sector that's, can deliver on carbon, can deliver on community impacts, both and globally. If Molly, as you guys say, the United States, we forget we have land. It's in every single one of our nation's pros, right? We're the land of milk and honey, Amber's ways of grain. That was for a reason, because people came here and saw the asset that we have. We've forgotten that, and we need to manage our American farmlands and our investment in farms as a investment in our national security for the future. And that comes from the private sector as well as government. But I think the private sector has been sitting on the sideline for a long time, and just on a mission to really get the investment back in our American farms and rural America.
Well said. And one closing thought, I mean, also on that, thinking about it, if we don't put our money towards our unspent possible futures that we want, don't be surprised if it's a bad future. And we may want to think about things like Amazon and Walmart, which are in the supply chain business. But like you said, if we aren't fed, nobody's happy.
Well, I guess we have 3 minutes to go. So, I mean, obviously, one of the things, Aaron, about that is because this is now becoming an international topic and need of food, and as you said, the capital that's needed more and more to make sure. Is there a fast growth of companies buying the small people's farms, and is that inevitable? It's going to continue. Right. I mean, even Chinese companies buying American farms. Is this issue that we're talking about going to just speed this up?
I think just the question. I don't think we actually know that answer. So that's kind of really interesting. I know Molly had mentioned that. I wish we did, but I do think the question is who's investing, where are they investing is going to matter. We know that China is making some big plays, particularly in Africa. Some countries have set big goals to be food suppliers. Ireland, for example, has set a major goal to be the world supplier of food. It's from a competitive advantage perspective. I think we forget that U.S. agriculture does supply much of the world, yet we also see the need to have food sovereignty invested in many nations, because then it leads into civil unrest. So we need to manage and think about it both ways. And also in U.S. agriculture, we have incredible technology and innovation that is our export, right, as well. We often forget that's not the direct product, but it's the technology and know-how that really gives us the competitive advantage.
I remember the Chinese Marshall Plan, is to go to a place like Africa and teach them how to grow better food and help them politically.
And they're coming to the United States. So this is something my research group actually really digs into. We are seeing a Chinese acquisition of American agricultural land. We have rules that are supposed to be followed to record all that. And we know, at least in some states, I won't name names, but there are two next door. One is goody two shoes and one kept all its records in a banker's box, which disappeared between last year and this year.
Interesting times.
So for the next hour, we're going to do about happiness and agricultural data and technology.
Well, I'll hold hands and say kumbaya, right?
All right. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, David, because I think you want to close it up now. But I just want to thank everybody for participating in this and listening to it. I mean, this is one of the most important things going around the world right now, and certainly our country. Thank God that you're all working on it, and eventually we can get more stories out there to teach America about what's happening, which is one of the goals. And so if you have story ideas, feed them my way, especially ones that have a chance for me to get out of the building and travel again and do stories, please do. But anyway, thanks again for everything you're doing. David, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. This has been really great. Thank you for hosting this special Geotech Hour. Thank you, Aaron and Molly. For everyone in the audience, I see there's additional questions that we weren't able to get to. If you jump to our 1 p.m. private roundtable that's now going to go on, we are now in day 2 of Aggregate Action. We have day 2 and day 3. Day 2 is more conversations like this. If you haven't registered yet, all you have to do is go to tinyurl.com/agritech, all one word. Again, tinyurl.com/agritech, AGRITECH, and register at that link. We're now going to jump over to there. But again, thank you, Bob. Thank you, Molly. Thank you, Aaron. Really appreciate everything you do as positive change agents.
Thanks, Dolly.